Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Following an interim nuclear agreement reached on the 2nd of April between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the P5+1, which consists out of the United States, Russia, China, France, Britain and Germany, it seems like the sides are still far from reaching a final agreement that is set for the 30th of June. With us to discuss the developments in the studio are Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, Mr. Owen Alterman. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd like also to welcome the former regional head of the Mossad in Iran, Mr. Eliezer Tsafrir. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome TV7's Iran analyst, Dr. Eldad Pardo.
Okay.
Eldad, so many things has happened since the 2nd of April, with on one hand, boasting on both sides of reaching some kind of an accomplishment, but at the same time, a lot of disputes when it comes to the practicalities of this agreement. What's going on?
Well, the very night that we heard, the declaration about the agreement, I was in the Golan Heights and I was listening to Tehran radio in Persian, and the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, he said to the listeners, look, you are going to hear in the coming days many versions and many narratives about this story, about this agreement. Don't believe it. Believe me. We are doing the right thing. And from that moment, I started to be suspicious. And I think what we heard from President Obama, both in the NPR interview and his interview in the New York Times, that on the one hand he says, not in my watch, and then after 10 years, the breakout time is zero. And, we had so many versions, and even things that were supposed to be clear, for example, Pardo. It's very important to know what will be done in Pardo with the centrifuges instead of, the uranium. Every detail is extremely important. But I think one thing is clear. This is a 10-year agreement. It has clear connotations in Islamic and particularly Shiite history. It means this is an interim agreement between enemies, and it's not a reconciliation whatsoever. Iran is the same revolutionary Iran, planning revolutions in every corner of the world, as Article 154 of the Constitution states.
Mr. Alterman, the United States released a document following the interim agreement with certain guidelines of what they interpreted the document to actually portray as the agreement. And the Iranians have very strongly rebuked this document, saying it's one big lie. But at the same time, the United States said it's not a lie, and this is the basis for all negotiations in the future if there is to be a final agreement in the 30th of June. What are we seeing here?
We're seeing an agreement that's not an agreement. I think it's pretty clear, as Eldad mentioned. This is a document that both sides wanted to come out, or at least a set of documents that both sides wanted to be released because they didn't want these talks to break down. They didn't get where they really wanted, which was some kind of signed framework agreement by the end of March, or as it happened by April 2nd. So they did the best they could, which is paper over their differences, or in this case, not even paper over their differences, but at least stake out their positions and the extent to which they've narrowed, and they have narrowed over the course of the past 2 years. Critics of the agreement inside the United States or from Israel will say they've narrowed because the Americans have made, in their view, too many concessions. But they have narrowed, and these documents are a basis of showing what gaps do remain. And on the basis, I think we can all decide and estimate what we expect going forward and whether we really expect a deal by the 30th of June.
Mr. Tsafrir, with regard to what's happening inside Iran, there's been a lot of criticism from the hardliners seeing Iran making concessions in their point of view when it comes to the nuclear program, and at the same time the political echelon saying we didn't make any concessions, we still have our core of honor and the national interests of the Iranian people, and so on and so forth. What is truly happening inside Iran?
Well, I couldn't say what is really true there, because you can see a lot of pictures which contrast each other. There are the hardliners who opposes the agreement, And they are the people, even the young people, the youth, running and dancing in the streets. And this is really very, very interesting, because as we know, everybody knows that nearly 80% of the Iranian people are youth who were born during the revolution or after, and they want a radical change back into sanity. And they were dancing now in the streets, which make me try to explain it as if most of the Iranian people are educated on the heritage of a superpower, a megalomaniac feeling of superpower, which Iran was in history. And they feel, even those who want complete change back to sanity, even they, when you ask them, they say nuclear, yes. We are pro. About the radicals, I wouldn't consider too much, because Khamenei, the
Supreme
leader,
Yes.
he is a symbol of the extremism. So don't miss up, because he knows what he wants to come through. Especially when we heard Dr. Pardo explaining how Minister of Foreign Affairs is explaining about the versions, all the versions that you Iranians are going to listen to, believe only me, and he has got, even a day after a day, a certain version which is different than the other day. In fact, nobody knows really if there is a document complete with an agreement. So still we have to wait and to see what will be going on in Iran. For the time being, the Iranian people are very satisfied with the agreement, because all of them, including those who oppose the regime, they want the change economically. And they believe that the sanctions will be taken off soon.
Dr. Pardo, I'm quite curious about this document. As we heard Mr. Tsafrir talking about, nobody really knows whether there truly is a document or not. We could see the United States, as we stated at the beginning, has released a certain document following the negotiations. The French have also released a document which didn't per se contradict the American document, but has elaborated on certain points and aspects of the negotiations. Was this interim agreement actually a certain cover-up for another extension?
This may be. I would say that if you look at it from the Iranian point of view, Iran cannot fully normalize. They cannot reach a reconciliation, because this will have repercussions on the entire political and economic structure inside. And people will start to ask, well, why do we need this regime in the first place if you are just a normal country? Again, Javad Zarif, he wrote in a book he published only 2 years ago, he said, we are not Malaysia. We are Iran. We have a global agenda, and this gives us problem with the West. The West does not accept that. So they understand. On the other hand, Iran needs an accommodation, an agreement. They must have it. It's a question of do or die for two reasons. First of all, as we heard, economically, and there is a lot of anger among large segments of the population. And then there is a question of transition. Khamenei is sick, and he will not live forever, like all of us. And he wants to guarantee, he wants to guarantee some period of quiet in order to safeguard the continuity of the revolution. That's why he tries to keep the revolution with all its aggression, but gain some time.
Mr. Alterman, what we're hearing here is very interesting. especially as we hear that there is a certain regime difficulty at the current time. We could also hear just a couple of weeks ago President Obama talking in response to Netanyahu's demand that Iran recognize Israel as part of a final agreement, in which Obama responded that there needs to be a certain understanding that there is no regime change and this is still the same regime we're talking about. Is there here some kind of dialogue between the West towards Iran saying you will receive all those possibilities the moment you'll be more like Germany, if I quote the American president, in which Iran will be able to receive a nuclear program?
Well, I think the dynamic is a little bit different. You know, in law school, we learned that sometimes negotiations work when the two sides have different expectations. And I think that's the situation here. The two parties have very different expectations about what the consequences will be of lifting the sanctions. From the Iranian perspective, they believe that lifting the sanctions will ensure the survival of the regime, as Mr. Pardo just said, Dr. Pardo just said. It will ensure the survival of the regime, and it will ensure the transition that Khamenei wants. From the perspective of the West and of President Obama, he won't say this, but what he says implicitly is that the opening up of Iran, both economically and in terms of foreign investment, in terms of people-to-people contacts, will bring about a change from within, whether that be a revolution or a regime change, whether that will be change within the regime. And because the two sides have such different expectations about what lifting of the sanctions will mean, they both agree that the sanctions should be lifted. And so I don't think that Obama is saying Iran will receive the full relief only after it changes, although that may be partly true. I think Obama actually believes that the lifting of the sanctions will be a cause of the change. And I don't know who's right, time will tell, but there's no question, from what I can see, that the Iranian public, and especially the Iranian middle class, their lives have been embittered by these sanctions. In many cases, they're an innocent third party to this dispute between the West and the regime, not between the Iranian public. And they've been the victims. And so there's no question, and it's quite understandable that they're very excited about the prospects of the deal. The question is, what will they do once the sanctions are lifted? Will they then bring about the type of political change that Obama and the West seem to expect, or at least hope for?
Mr. Tsafrir.
No way for a change in Iran. This is, you can't compare it, for example, to the newly opening between the United States and Cuba. Not at all. Cuba, even the president, the Cuban president said that they are ready to discuss various things, including human rights and so on. This is completely different. There is no way that this regime will be open to any negotiation about changes inside Iran. Indeed, the majority of the Iranian people, they won't change. Of course they won't change. Maybe the West, headed by the President Obama, believe that lifting the sanctions and bringing a better economical situation will encourage the change. Yes, I'm not sure this is the major thing, but in my opinion, there are two major factors running to the end line in Iran. One is the bomb, unfortunately, is going to be the first, and the other thing is the change. The change will come. Nobody, no intelligence organization can evaluate exactly when it will come, especially when it doesn't get the backing of the big powers, the West. But it will be coming, but not as a result of a wish by America or any other party.
Dr. Pardo?
I think we have major problems ahead. First of all, the team Rafsanjani, Rouhani, in the 1990s, they were the pragmatists. The pragmatists said, okay, we must try to create a division between Europe and the United States, behave a little more carefully, and apply a lot of international terrorism. This is when Rouhani was most likely involved in bombing the AMIA, the Jewish Cultural Center, in 1994 in Buenos Aires. If you remember, Kobar Tower, 1996, was supposed to kill hundreds of Americans, and there was many assassinations in Europe, and so on and forth. And they started the nuclear program. This was early 1990s. And they repeat, and Rouhani said also when he was the chief negotiator between 2003 2004, he said, okay, we stop these parts of the program, but we continue in the technologically where we have some disadvantage. So this is the policy. And what we see even in the last few months, that they kind of allow the Revolutionary Guards, Quds Force, a freedom. The Supreme Leader gave them freedom. For example, what we see in Yemen, this civil war could have erupted 2 years ago, 3 years ago. How comes all of a sudden the Houthis begin this kind of invasion? They are in Aden. These are a part of the game inside Iran, and maybe some understandings between Iran and the United States. Who knows what's going on? The Middle East is very opaque. So this is one thing. That there is just one point that we have to add through analyzing Iran's educational system and what's going on in Iran. There are some irrational elements that were added, like mystical decision making. This is something that is based on some kind of Sufi Irfani tradition. This is something that is taught across the schools. All the future elite, they believe, and they are taught how the Supreme Leader is connected directly to the divine through the 10 emanations and the angels, just like Prophet Muhammad. This is something that was not, Khomeini believed he was getting direct instructions from God, and so the Shah. But these people kept their mouths shut. They believed in that, but they didn't say it. Now everybody assumes that there are some mystical powers, and you must obey the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader is entitled to approve any new weapon. So all of this is very difficult if we want to build some kind of deterrence system. It's not what people think. They don't understand Iranian philosophy. It is not the Sunni philosophy. It's a Shi'i Iranian mixed philosophy and a revolutionary. It's very complicated to disentangle and to understand.
Mr. Alterman, I'd like to move on to the regional instability that is occurring currently. But first of all, last sentence from you on this matter.
Well, again, I go back to what I said. I think this is a case of two sides having very different expectations about what will happen. Obama clearly seems to think that the sanctions have run their course. When Netanyahu comes out and says, when Obama challenges Netanyahu and says, what's the alternative to the deal? Netanyahu essentially says a continuation of the status quo, a continuation of using sanctions as a lever of pressure. Obama doesn't seem to consider that a viable alternative, because he seems to think, again, rightly or wrongly, that the sanctions have run their course. And he seems to think that implicitly that lifting the sanctions will bring about, sooner or later, political change within Iran, either within the regime, or, if not within the regime, a revolutionary change from outside the regime. We can only hope he's right.
Mr. Tsafrir, last sentence on this matter.
Well, I agree with what has been said until now. There is no way for a change in Iran. It is not for the United States, however big power they are, to decide for the Iranians what is the wish. What Dr. Pardo was saying about the extremism and the Masonic feeling, it has occurred already in the time of Ahmadinejad. He has his own Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi in Qom. They built a big gate for the Mahdi to come. So it's something really one cannot understand in the West. You cannot get into their interior thinking in order to know what they are. But in my opinion, Khamenei and whoever will succeed him, backed by the Revolutionary Guard, they are not going to change unless the change will come from within inside by the millions of youth people who were coming to the streets and were oppressed at the time.
Dr. Pardo, we understand from this conversation, of course, and you've also stated this in the past in previous programs, regarding the Shia Iranian aspirations for regional dominance. Just recently we heard the European Union's Counterterrorism Council had warning about Iranian involvement in proxy war, which this is going to become the major issue. And just in the past 2 weeks, there's been a certain shift since the interim agreement was reached by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he continuously warns about Iranian involvement in regional dominance, in financing proxy wars, in assisting the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Iraq, the Shia militia, as well as the government of Iraq itself, which is also ironically Western-backed. How difficult will this situation become if the West will not couple the dangers of Iran striving for regional dominance while at the same time marching towards a nuclear weapon?
I think I think the alternative to this deal is a better deal. This is not just a slogan. A better deal means much more structure on two fronts. Structure inside. First, from my point of view, that I'm not a nuclear expert, I think the first element in the structure is prolonging the time. It has to be at 25 years, because 10 years is too much of symbolic religiously, that it means that this is not a deal, that it's just a game. So it has to go along for 25 years, the same restrictions unchanged. And because in principle they accepted it for 10 years, there is no problem in principle to prolong it, because all the science, everything goes on. And this will guarantee some calm inside Iran, and also will allow for the Iranians to keep the regime, but change in a moderate, non-violent manner, which they want. And then in the Middle East at large, there must be red lines agreed upon by the main powers in the region, and of course the United States, where Iran is not supposed to be, and where they are allowed to be, because they have also their defense interests.
Right.
But right now everything is fluid.
Mr. Tsafrir?
It's important to emphasize the regional and global danger of Iran beside the matter of nuclear, because nearly all the leaders in Iran have been very, very free lately, with no shame, to declare that the Iranian empire is back in the picture, and one of them even said that the capital is Iraq. And now they're speaking about everything freely. So, in my opinion, and not only mine, the head of the serpent lies in Tehran. It is there the source of disturbances and the source of problems in the whole region.
Mr. Alterman?
I think an interesting dynamic, and this is implicit, at least in what I hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu, is that he is more concerned about a legitimate Iran than he is about a nuclear Iran. That is to say, when President Obama asks Prime Minister Netanyahu, what's the alternative to this deal? And Netanyahu says a continuation of the status quo as a path to getting a better deal, or if not a better deal, at least a continuation of the pressure. And Obama says then, okay, but look at what Iran's already done, even with this pressure on it. It might come to a nuclear bomb. And what Netanyahu comes back with, he will never say this explicitly, but implicitly what he comes back with is, I understand, but I'm much more worried about the risk of a legitimate Iran, of an Iran with the sanctions lifted, of an Iran that's working with the United States throughout the region, of an Iran that has the pressure off of it and has a certain sense of international legitimacy. And I'm so worried about that I'm willing to prevent that, even at the risk of Iran becoming a nuclear state, or at least continuing to be a nuclear threshold state. And I think the reason why he takes that position is exactly what was said, is that Iran has so many other tools with which to be disruptive in the region and threatening to Israel, even without the bomb, that it can use those tools in a much more effective and dangerous way if it has international legitimacy. So, of course, we would all rather Iran not be a nuclear threshold state and also not have international legitimacy. If we have to pick between one or the other, at least implicitly, Prime Minister Netanyahu has cast his vote that he would prefer Iran to be a nuclear threshold state, but continue to be an international pariah. Obama seems to think that the reverse is better.
Dr. Pardo, Mr. Alterman says here something very interesting, and we can also see now that the Russians, right after the agreement was, the interim agreement was reached, they have announced that they will transfer the S-300 anti-rocket or anti-aircraft missile systems to Iran, an agreement that was back in 2010 but didn't reach Tehran after all. Is this something that goes hand in hand with what Mr. Alterman just said about Netanyahu being more afraid of the legitimacy of Iran's capabilities in actually arming itself and making itself protected in the face of future international pressure rather than being a nuclear threshold state?
Well, here I must disagree. It's not that I'm a Netanyahu expert, but I don't think that Netanyahu would take Iran becoming nuclear so lightly. I would say that there is an opportunity, and the opportunity is now to change Iran policies, because Iran wants everybody in Iran, extremists, supreme leader, common people, everyone wants a peaceful transition into another Iran. Nobody knows exactly what that means. This means that you can put a little bit more structure to an agreement that we have achieved after sanctions and all that. And with this, we can hope that Iranian dreams of having hegemony, influence, and actually I would even share with them, they want to have an alternative way of life to the West.
We'll have to end here as we're out of time. I would like to thank you, Mr. Eliezer Tsafrir, for being here at the program. Mr. Owen Alterman, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Dr. Eldad Pardo.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure indeed. And I'd like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next time.